The sun was setting over the calm waters of Chesapeake Bay, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The gentle waves lapped against the sides of a sleek white yacht that drifted lazily across the surface. On board was Admiral Marcus Johnson, a man who had spent decades serving his country with honor and distinction. He was a decorated Navy officer, known for his sharp mind, leadership skills, and unwavering dedication to duty. But on this particular evening, none of those things mattered. To anyone watching from afar, he looked like just another civilian enjoying a quiet day on the water. Admiral Johnson had earned every stripe on his uniform through years of hard work and sacrifice. Born into a modest family in a small town in Georgia, he had grown up hearing stories of bravery and service from his grandfather who had fought in World War II. Those tales ignited a spark within young Marcus, inspiring him to join the Navy at the age of 18. Over the years, he rose through the ranks, earning promotions and accolades along the way. Today, he held one of the highest positions in the U.S. Navy, commanding respect wherever he went. But none of that was visible now. Dressed in a simple polo shirt and khakis without any insignia or medals, Admiral Johnson blended seamlessly into the sea of ordinary boaters dotting the bay. This rare moment of solitude was precious to him. Life as a high-ranking military official meant long hours, constant pressure, and little time for personal relaxation. For months, he had been tied up with meetings, strategy sessions, and international conferences. Finally, he had managed to carve out a few hours to himself. The yacht belonged to him, a gift from his late father who had always dreamed of owning such a vessel but never could afford it. Now Marcus cherished it not just as a possession, but as a connection to his roots, a reminder of how far he had come. As the yacht glided smoothly over the water, Marcus leaned back in his chair, letting the cool breeze wash over him. He closed his eyes for a moment, savoring the peace and quiet. There were no ringing phones, no urgent emails, no aides rushing around him. Just the sound of the wind and the occasional cry of a seagull overhead. It was exactly what he needed after weeks of relentless stress. Little did he know, however, that this tranquil evening was about to take a dramatic turn. Unbeknownst to Admiral Johnson, trouble was brewing nearby. Earlier that day, local authorities had received an anonymous tip about suspicious activity involving a black man aboard a luxury yacht in the area. The caller claimed to have seen crates being loaded onto the boat under cover of darkness, raising suspicions of illegal smuggling. While vague, the report came at a time when tensions were already running high. Recent news stories had highlighted several high-profile smuggling operations along the East Coast, prompting increased vigilance among law enforcement agencies. In response, the U.S. Coast Guard dispatched a patrol boat to investigate further. Their mission was straightforward: identify any potential threats and take necessary action. The Coast Guard crew consisted of 4 officers, all relatively new to the force. Among them was Petty Officer Daniels, a young man eager to prove himself in his first major assignment. Beside him stood Ensign Carter, fresh out of training and still adjusting to the weight of responsibility that came with wearing the uniform. Leading the team was Lieutenant Harris, a seasoned officer tasked with ensuring everything ran smoothly. None of them knew much about the details of the tip. They only knew they had orders to follow. As their cutter sliced through the water, Lieutenant Harris briefed his team. "We've got a report of suspicious activity near Marker 14, he said, pointing to a map spread out on the dashboard. "A black male aboard a white yacht, possibly involved in smuggling. Stay alert." The mention of race didn't raise eyebrows. It was part of the description provided by the caller. Still, there was an unspoken tension in the air. Everyone understood the implications of targeting someone based solely on appearance, but they also knew they couldn't ignore credible leads. Through binoculars, Petty Officer Daniels spotted a yacht matching the description floating peacefully in the distance. "That's it," he announced, handing the binoculars to Lieutenant Harris. The lieutenant studied the vessel carefully, noting its size and pristine condition. Something about it seemed off. Too quiet, too serene. If smuggling activities were indeed taking place, they weren't obvious. Nevertheless, protocol demanded they investigate. "Approach slowly," Lieutenant Harris instructed the helmsman. "Let's not spook them if we can avoid it." As the Coast Guard cutter drew nearer, the officers prepared themselves for what lay ahead. They strapped on life jackets, double-checked their gear, and rehearsed their plans silently. No one spoke. Of the racial aspect of the report, it hovered in the background, unacknowledged yet undeniable. For now, their focus remained on the task at hand, identifying any potential threat and neutralizing it if necessary. Back aboard the yacht, Admiral Johnson noticed movement on the horizon. At first, he thought little of it. Boats passed each other frequently in these waters. But as the approaching vessel grew closer, its flashing blue lights became unmistakable. A knot formed in his stomach as realization dawned. The Coast Guard was heading straight for him. Confusion clouded his mind. What could they possibly want with him? He slowed the yacht to a stop, turning off the engine to allow the patrol boat to pull alongside. Within moments, 2 uniformed officers stepped onto his deck, their expressions stern and businesslike. One of them immediately barked, "Sir, step back and keep your hands where we can see them." Marcus raised his arms slightly, careful not to make any sudden movements. His heart pounded, though he kept his voice steady. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone polite but firm. The officers ignored his question, their eyes scanning the yacht for anything suspicious. Another officer appeared behind them, holding a clipboard. "We've received reports of unauthorized activity in these waters," the lead guard explained tersely. "You'll need to come with us for questioning." Marcus frowned, his patience beginning to fray. "I assure you I'm doing nothing wrong here. This is my personal time and I'm simply out for a sail." But his words fell on deaf ears. The officers weren't interested in explanations. They were focused on following protocol. Within minutes, Admiral Johnson found himself being escorted off his own yacht, handcuffed like a common criminal. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who had dedicated his entire life to protecting his nation, being treated as a suspect because of the color of his skin. Yet, despite the injustice of it all, Marcus maintained his composure. He knew better than to escalate the situation. Instead, he resolved to let the truth speak for itself, trusting that reason and logic would prevail in the end. As the Coast Guard cutter sped away with him aboard, Marcus stared back at his yacht, wondering how this night would unfold, and whether justice would ultimately be served. The Coast Guard cutter sped through the water, its engine roaring as it cut across the waves. Admiral Marcus Johnson sat silently in the back, his hands still cuffed behind him. The cool night breeze whipped against his face, but he barely felt it. His mind was racing, replaying the events of the past hour over and over again. He couldn't believe what had just happened. How could this be real? A man of his stature, a decorated Navy admiral, arrested like a criminal, on his own boat, no less. It was surreal, almost laughable if it weren't so infuriating. Around him, the Coast Guard officers went about their duties with practiced efficiency. They didn't speak much, their faces masks of professionalism, but Marcus could sense the unease beneath their calm exteriors. Petty Officer Daniels kept glancing at him out of the corner of his eye, clearly uncomfortable. Ensign Carter fidgeted with his clipboard, avoiding direct eye contact altogether. Even Lieutenant Harris, who had given the orders to arrest him, seemed tense, gripping the railing tightly as the boat rocked gently in the current. When they finally arrived at the Coast Guard station, Marcus was led off the cutter and into the building. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed loudly, casting harsh shadows on the walls. The air smelled faintly of salt water mixed with cleaning supplies, a stark contrast to the fresh ocean breeze he had been enjoying just hours earlier. He was taken to a small interrogation room, where he was instructed to sit down at a metal table bolted to the floor. One of the officers removed his handcuffs but made it clear that he wasn't free to leave. For several minutes, Marcus sat alone in the cold, sterile room, the silence pressed down on him, broken only by the distant hum of activity outside the door. He stared at the blank wall in front of him, trying to make sense of everything. Was this some kind of misunderstanding? Had someone made a mistake? Or was this something more sinister? an act driven by prejudice disguised as protocol. Finally, the door opened, and Lieutenant Harris entered, followed by another officer carrying a notepad. Harris pulled out a chair and sat across from Marcus, clearing his throat nervously before speaking. "Sir," he began, his voice clipped and formal, "we need you to answer a few questions regarding your activities tonight." Marcus raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "Questions?" he repeated calmly. "About what exactly?" "I was sailing my yacht, that's all." Harris hesitated, glancing briefly at the other officer before continuing. "We received a report suggesting suspicious behavior involving your vessel. Specifically," he trailed off, flipping through the pages of his notebook, "activity consistent with smuggling operations." Marcus blinked slowly, processing the words. Smuggling? On his yacht? The accusation was so absurd that for a moment he thought Harris might be joking, but the lieutenant's face remained serious, even grim. "That's ridiculous," Marcus said firmly, leaning forward slightly. "There's nothing illegal on my boat. You're welcome to search it if you'd like. You won't find anything." Harris nodded stiffly. "We already conducted a preliminary inspection. Nothing turned up." Marcus crossed his arms, his frustration mounting. "Then why am I here? Why was I arrested?" Harris shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "The tip we received included specific details that matched your description and location. We had to investigate further." Marcus narrowed his eyes. "What kind of details?" he asked pointedly. Harris hesitated again, clearly reluctant to elaborate. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, almost apologetic. "The caller mentioned a blackmail aboard a white yacht." The words hung in the air like a storm cloud, heavy and suffocating. Marcus felt a surge of anger rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew better than to let emotion get the better of him. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, studying Harris carefully. "So let me get this straight," he said slowly, enunciating each word. "You detained me, not because of any actual evidence, but because someone called in saying there was a black man on a yacht?" Harris looked away, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. "It's standard procedure to follow up on credible tips," he muttered defensively. Marcus shook his head, incredulous. "Credible? Based on what? My race? That's not credibility. That's profiling." The room fell silent except for the faint buzzing of the overhead lights. Harris opened his mouth to respond but closed it again, unsure of what to say. After a long pause, Marcus sighed deeply, running a hand over his face. "Look," he said, his tone softer now, though still firm. "I understand you're just doing your job, but this isn't right. I'm not some random suspect. I'm Admiral Marcus Johnson. Do you know who I am?" Harris frowned, clearly caught off guard. "Admiral Johnson?" he echoed, his voice tinged with disbelief. Marcus nodded, watching as realization dawned on the younger man's face. "Yes," Marcus continued. "I've served in the U.S. Navy for over 30 years. I've held positions of leadership and responsibility. And yet tonight I was treated like a criminal, all because of the color of my skin." His voice carried a weight that made Harris shrink slightly in his seat. For the first time since entering the room, the lieutenant looked genuinely ashamed. Outside the interrogation room, whispers began to spread among the other officers. Someone had recognized the name Admiral Marcus Johnson and quickly alerted Captain Reynolds, the commanding officer of the station. Within minutes, panic rippled through the ranks as senior officials scrambled to rectify the blunder. Captain Reynolds burst into the room, his face flushed with embarrassment. "Admiral Johnson," he exclaimed, extending a hand. "Please accept my deepest apologies. This is unacceptable." Marcus stood up slowly, ignoring the offered handshake. His demeanor remained composed, but his piercing gaze left no doubt about his feelings. "Captain Reynolds," he said evenly, "this incident raises serious questions about how assumptions are made and acted upon within your organization. It's not enough to apologize. Changes must be implemented to prevent such occurrences in the future." Reynolds nodded vigorously, already mentally drafting memos and directives. Meanwhile, the junior officers involved in the arrest shuffled awkwardly outside the door, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. News of the debacle reached higher levels of command almost instantly, sparking urgent discussions about accountability and reform within the Coast Guard. As the gravity of the situation sank in, Marcus realized that this was bigger than just him. It wasn't just about being wrongfully detained, it was about exposing the flaws in the system that allowed such mistakes to happen in the first place. And while part of him wanted to walk away and forget the whole ordeal, another part knew he couldn't. If anyone could turn this unfortunate event into an opportunity for change, it was him. By the time Marcus left the station later that night, escorted by Captain Reynolds himself, the story had already begun to circulate. Social media platforms lit up with reactions ranging from outrage to disbelief. Journalists scrambled to piece together the details, eager to report on what many were calling a glaring example of racial profiling. Marcus ignored the cameras and microphones thrust in his direction, choosing instead to retreat to the privacy of his home. But as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The arrest may have ended, but the implications of what had happened would linger. For him, for the Coast Guard, and for society at large. Marcus knew that true justice wouldn't come from punishing those who had detained him. It would come from addressing the root causes that had led to the arrest in the first place. And as he drifted off to sleep, he resolved to use his platform to ensure that meaningful change followed in the wake of this injustice. The sun rose the next morning, casting golden light over Chesapeake Bay once again. But for Admiral Marcus Johnson, the waters ahead were far from calm. The morning after the arrest, Admiral Marcus Johnson woke up to a world that felt very different from the one he had gone to bed in. The quiet solitude of his home was shattered by the incessant ringing of phones and the buzz of notifications on his devices. By dawn, news outlets across the country had picked up the story, turning what should have been a private matter into a full-blown national scandal. Headlines screamed variations of the same theme: U.S. Coast Guard arrests, Navy Admiral mistakenly, racial profiling scandal rocks law enforcement, and Admiral detained based on anonymous tip. Social media platforms were ablaze with reactions, some outraged, others incredulous, and a few even mocking the situation. Marcus ignored most of it. He wasn't new to public scrutiny. As a high-ranking military official, he had faced criticism and praise alike throughout his career. But this was different. This wasn't about policy decisions or strategic failures. It was deeply personal. It struck at the core of who he was. A black man in America, judged not by his achievements, but by the color of his skin. Sitting in his study, sipping a cup of coffee, Marcus scrolled through some of the comments online. Some people defended him passionately, calling for accountability and reform within law enforcement. Others dismissed the incident as an innocent mistake, arguing that the Coast Guard was only doing its job. And then there were those who questioned why someone like him, a successful, wealthy individual, would even care about such issues. Why does it always have to be about race? One commenter wrote sarcastically. Marcus stared at the screen for a moment before setting his phone aside. That question, more than anything else, summed up the challenge ahead. How could he explain to people who didn't understand what it meant to live under constant suspicion? How could he make them see that this wasn't just about him? It was about every person who had ever been judged unfairly because of their appearance. Later that day, Marcus received a call from Captain Reynolds, the commanding officer of the Coast Guard station. The captain sounded nervous, his voice trembling slightly as he apologized once again. "Admiral Johnson, I want to assure you that we're taking this matter extremely seriously," he said. "We've launched an internal investigation and steps are being taken to ensure this never happens again." Marcus listened patiently, appreciating the effort but knowing that words alone wouldn't fix the problem. "I appreciate your apology, Captain," he replied evenly. "But actions speak louder than words. Let's focus on meaningful change." Reynolds agreed wholeheartedly, promising updates as the investigation progressed. When the call ended, Marcus leaned back in his chair, lost in thought. He knew the Coast Guard wasn't entirely to blame. They were following protocol based on information they'd received, but the fact remained that the system itself was flawed. Anonymous tips weren't inherently bad, but when they relied heavily on racial descriptions without corroborating evidence, they became dangerous tools of bias. Someone had seen a black man on a yacht and assumed wrongdoing. Why? Because society often equated wealth and leisure with whiteness, leaving little room for people of color to exist outside stereotypes. As the days passed, the fallout continued to unfold. The Coast Guard issued a formal statement acknowledging the error and vowing to address systemic issues within its ranks. Training programs were revamped to include modules on cultural sensitivity and implicit bias. Officers involved in the arrest faced disciplinary measures ranging from written reprimands to temporary suspensions. While many praised these efforts as steps in the right direction, others criticized them as insufficient band-aids over gaping wounds. For Marcus, the public spectacle was both exhausting and motivating. On one hand, he wanted nothing more than to retreat from the spotlight and return to his normal life. On the other hand, he recognized the unique opportunity this incident presented. As a respected figure with influence, he had a platform to drive real change. Quietly but resolutely, he began reaching out to colleagues, activists, and policymakers, initiating conversations about racial profiling and institutional reform. He didn't seek fame or recognition. He simply wanted to ensure that no one else would have to endure what he had. Meanwhile, the media frenzy showed no signs of slowing down. Reporters camped outside his house, hoping to catch a glimpse of him leaving or returning. News anchors debated whether the incident was an isolated case of mistaken identity or indicative of deeper systemic problems. Late-night talk show hosts cracked jokes about the absurdity of arresting a decorated admiral, while daytime television hosts invited experts to discuss the broader implications of racial bias in law enforcement. Amid all the noise, Marcus remained silent. He declined interview requests, choosing instead to let the facts speak for themselves. One evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Marcus reflected on everything that had happened. The anger he had initially felt had softened somewhat, replaced by a sense of purpose. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about using his experience to inspire others and push for lasting reform. He thought about the young officers who had detained him, their awkwardness, their discomfort, their fear of making a mistake. They weren't villains. They were products of a flawed system. If anything, they needed guidance and education as much as anyone else. Determined to channel his frustration into action, Marcus drafted a brief statement to release to the press. In it, he emphasized the importance of addressing racial bias in law enforcement and urged meaningful action rather than empty rhetoric. True justice, he wrote, isn't achieved by punishing individuals. It's achieved by fixing the systems that allow injustice to thrive. The statement was concise yet powerful, earning widespread praise from advocates and critics alike. Back at the Coast Guard station, the atmosphere was tense but focused. Captain Reynolds held daily meetings with his team, emphasizing the need for transparency and accountability. Officers participated in workshops designed to highlight unconscious biases and encourage open dialogue. Morale was low, but there was also a shared determination to improve. Petty Officer Daniels, who had been among those to board Marcus's yacht, found himself grappling with guilt. He replayed the events in his mind repeatedly, wondering if he could have done something differently. Ensign Carter, meanwhile, struggled with self-doubt, questioning whether he was cut out for a career in law enforcement. Lieutenant Harris bore the brunt of the criticism, both internally and externally. His decision to detain Admiral Johnson, based on an anonymous tip, haunted him. At night, he lay awake replaying the scene in his head, imagining alternative scenarios where he might have handled things better. Yet, despite the weight of responsibility, Harris vowed to learn from the experience. He attended every training session, asked tough questions, and sought feedback from his superiors. Slowly but surely, he began to rebuild trust, not just with his team, but with himself. By the end of the week, the initial shock of the incident had settled into a steady rhythm of reflection and action. For Marcus, the journey was far from over. He knew that true change wouldn't happen overnight. It required persistence, patience, and collaboration. But he also knew that moments like this, however painful, carried the potential to spark transformation. As he stood on the deck of his yacht once again, gazing out at the endless expanse of water, Marcus felt a renewed sense of hope. The waves may have been choppy, but the horizon ahead was clear, and with each passing day, he grew more determined to steer toward a brighter future, not just for himself, but for everyone navigating the same turbulent seas. The weeks following Admiral Marcus Johnson's arrest became a whirlwind of activity, both for him personally and for the institutions caught in the storm of public scrutiny. The incident had ignited conversations far beyond the confines of the Coast Guard station or even the military. It had become a national talking point dissected on news shows, social media threads, and dinner tables across America. For many, it was a glaring example of how deeply ingrained racial bias could infiltrate even the most disciplined organizations. For others, it was an uncomfortable mirror reflecting societal prejudices they preferred to ignore. Admiral Johnson chose not to engage directly with the media circus surrounding him. Instead, he focused his energy on quieter, more impactful avenues. He began attending virtual roundtable discussions hosted by advocacy groups and think tanks, speaking candidly about systemic racism and institutional reform. His presence alone commanded respect, but it was his measured tone and thoughtful insights that truly resonated. "This isn't about me," he would often say during these sessions. "It's about what we can do collectively to ensure fairness and equity for everyone." One such discussion took place at a prominent civil rights organization based in Washington, D.C. The panel included lawyers, activists, and academics, all united by a shared goal: dismantling discriminatory practices within law enforcement. When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he leaned forward slightly, his voice steady yet impassioned. "What happened to me wasn't unique," he began. "It happens every day to people who don't have the privilege of rank or recognition. The difference is I had the resources and visibility to push back. Most don't." His words struck a chord with the audience, many of whom nodded in agreement. One young activist raised her hand during the Q&A session asking, "How do we hold institutions accountable when they make mistakes like this?" Marcus paused before answering, choosing his words carefully. "Accountability starts with transparency," he said. "We need clear protocols, not just for handling complaints but for preventing them in the first place. And accountability also means consequences. If someone abuses their power, whether intentionally or unintentionally, there must be repercussions." The conversation extended well beyond the scheduled hour, with participants reluctant to end the dialogue. Afterward, several attendees approached Marcus privately, thanking him for using his platform to amplify marginalized voices. Though he appreciated their gratitude, Marcus reminded them that real change required collective effort. "I'm just one person," he told them, "but together we're unstoppable." Meanwhile, inside the U.S. Coast Guard, efforts to address the fallout were intensifying. Captain Reynolds, determined to restore trust and credibility, oversaw the implementation of sweeping reforms. Training programs now included mandatory workshops on implicit bias, cultural competency, and de-escalation tactics. Officers were encouraged to share personal experiences and discuss uncomfortable truths about race and policing. These sessions weren't always easy. Some participants grew defensive, while others broke down in tears. But the discomfort was seen as a necessary step toward progress. Lieutenant Harris, still grappling with guilt over his role in the arrest, threw himself into the reform initiatives. He volunteered to lead training modules, sharing his own story as a cautionary tale. "I made a mistake," he admitted during one session. "And because of that mistake, I hurt someone who didn't deserve it. My hope is that by learning from my failure, none of you will repeat it." His honesty earned him respect among his peers, though he remained haunted by the memory of handcuffing Admiral Johnson. Petty Officer Daniels and Ensign Carter, too, underwent significant transformations. Daniels, once eager to prove himself, now approached his duties with greater humility and caution. He realized that confidence without empathy could lead to harm, and he worked hard to strike a balance between the two. Carter, meanwhile, faced his insecurities head-on, seeking mentorship from senior officers and studying case studies of similar incidents. Both men emerged from the ordeal with a deeper understanding of the weight of their responsibilities. Public reaction to the Coast Guard's response was mixed. Some praised the organization for its swift action and willingness to confront uncomfortable truths. Others accused it of performing damage control rather than addressing underlying issues. Social media users debated endlessly, with hashtags like "Justice for Admiral Johnson" trending alongside critiques of law enforcement practices nationwide. Activists seized the moment to demand broader reforms, calling for legislative changes to combat racial profiling and increase accountability. In the midst of all this, Admiral Johnson received a letter from an unexpected source, the anonymous caller whose tip had triggered the chain of events. The letter arrived in a plain envelope postmarked from a nearby town. At first, Marcus hesitated to open it, unsure of what to expect. But curiosity got the better part of him, and he unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. "Dear Admiral Johnson," the note began, "I want to apologize for my part in what happened. I called the Coast Guard because I saw your yacht and thought something seemed off. Looking back, I realized my judgment was clouded by stereotypes I didn't even know I held. Please forgive me for causing you pain. Sincerely, a regretful citizen." Marcus read the letter twice, his expression unreadable. On one hand, he felt anger at the ignorance and prejudice that had led to his arrest. On the other hand, he felt a flicker of hope. This person, whoever they were, had taken responsibility for their actions and expressed remorse. It wasn't enough to undo the damage, but it was a start. He decided to respond. Picking up a pen, he wrote a brief reply. "Thank you for reaching out and acknowledging your mistake. Growth begins with reflection, and I commend you for taking this step. Let us work together to build a society where assumptions are replaced with understanding. Respectfully, Admiral Marcus Johnson." Sending the letter felt cathartic, as if closing a chapter while opening another. Marcus knew forgiveness wouldn't erase the past, but it might pave the way for healing. And healing, he believed, was essential, not just for individuals but for communities and institutions striving to do better. As the controversy gradually faded from headlines, life began to settle into a new rhythm. For Admiral Johnson, this meant returning to his duties as a Navy leader, albeit with a renewed sense of purpose. He incorporated lessons from his experience into leadership seminars, urging cadets to question biases and prioritize integrity. "Your uniform doesn't define you," he told them. "Your character does, never forget that." At the Coast Guard station, reforms continued to take root. Officers reported feeling more equipped to handle complex situations, thanks to the enhanced training programs. Captain Reynolds received commendations for his proactive approach, though he remained humble, crediting his team for their resilience and dedication. Even Lieutenant Harris found redemption, earning praise for his commitment to improving the system he had once inadvertently harmed. By the time autumn rolled around, Chesapeake Bay was alive with vibrant colors, golden leaves, azure skies, and sparkling waters. Admiral Marcus Johnson returned to his yacht, savoring the crisp air and peaceful solitude. As he sailed along the familiar routes, he reflected on how much had changed since that fateful evening. The scars of injustice still lingered, but so did the promise of progress. He glanced at the horizon where the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the waves. Somewhere out there, countless stories like his were unfolding, stories of struggle, resilience, and hope. And though the journey ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: change was possible. All it took was courage, determination, and a willingness to confront the truth. With that thought, Marcus steered his yacht toward home, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Months had passed since the night Admiral Marcus Johnson was wrongfully detained by the U.S. Coast Guard, but the ripple effects of that incident continued to shape lives and institutions. The initial shock had settled into a steady rhythm of reflection, accountability, and action. For Admiral Johnson, the experience wasn't just a personal ordeal. It had become a catalyst for broader conversations about racial bias, systemic reform, and leadership. As he navigated his role as both a Navy official and an advocate for change, Marcus found himself at the intersection of two worlds, one rooted in tradition and discipline, and the other demanding innovation and justice. One crisp autumn morning, Marcus stood on the stage of a packed auditorium at a naval conference in Norfolk, Virginia. The event brought together leaders from various branches of the military, government officials, and civilian experts to discuss modern challenges facing national security and law enforcement. His keynote address was highly anticipated, not only because of his distinguished career but also because of the recent spotlight on his arrest. Attendees whispered among themselves as they waited for him to begin, their curiosity palpable. When Marcus finally stepped up to the podium, the room fell silent. He adjusted the microphone, his calm demeanor masking the weight of what he was about to say. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his deep voice carrying authority without being overbearing. "Today, I want to talk about trust." A murmur of interest rippled through the audience. Trust, after all, was the cornerstone of effective leadership, whether in the military or any other field. Trust isn't given lightly, Marcus continued. It's earned through actions, not words. And it's fragile, easily broken when assumptions replace facts, when fear overrides reason, or when prejudice clouds judgment. He paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. What happened to me earlier this year was a stark reminder of how quickly trust can erode, not just between individuals, but within systems designed to protect us. The crowd listened, intently, hanging on every word. Some nodded in agreement, while others scribbled notes furiously. Marcus recounted the events of that evening on Chesapeake Bay, describing the arrest with clinical precision. He didn't embellish or dramatize. Instead, he presented the facts plainly, allowing their gravity to speak for themselves. "I was judged not by my actions, but by my appearance," he said. "And while I recognize that those involved were following protocol, the system they relied on failed them, and me." His tone remained measured, yet there was an undeniable intensity behind his words. "This isn't just about me," he emphasized. "It's about every person who has ever been profiled, stereotyped, or dismissed because of the color of their skin. It's about dismantling the structures that perpetuate inequality and replacing them with ones built on fairness and respect." The audience erupted into applause, many rising to their feet in admiration. Marcus acknowledged the gesture briefly before concluding his speech. True leadership isn't about wielding power, it's about fostering trust. And trust cannot exist where prejudice thrives. Let's commit ourselves to building systems that serve everyone equally, regardless of race, gender, or background. Because if we don't, we fail, not just as leaders, but as human beings. As he stepped away, from the podium, Marcus felt a mix of emotions. Pride for having articulated his thoughts so clearly, relief for unburdening himself in front of peers who understood the stakes, and determination for knowing that the work ahead would be neither quick nor easy. Outside the auditorium, journalists swarmed reporters eager to capture sound bites, but Marcus declined all requests. Instead, he retreated to a quiet corner of the venue, where he met privately with a small group of senior officers and policymakers. These meetings were informal, yet purposeful. Marcus used the opportunity to discuss concrete steps toward reform. Drawing on insights from his experiences and research, he advocated for standardized protocols to minimize reliance on anonymous tips lacking corroborating evidence. He pushed for greater transparency in decision-making processes, urging agencies to document and review incidents involving potential racial profiling. Most importantly, he stressed the need for ongoing education, not just for new recruits, but for seasoned professionals as well. Back at the Coast Guard station, the reforms initiated months earlier were beginning to bear fruit. Training programs now included immersive simulations designed to expose officers to real-world scenarios involving implicit bias. Participants were tasked with making split-second decisions under pressure, then debriefed afterward to analyze their thought processes. These exercises proved challenging, forcing officers to confront uncomfortable truths about their own assumptions and behaviors. Lieutenant Harris, once consumed by guilt, emerged as a champion of these initiatives. He collaborated closely with psychologists and sociologists to develop curriculum materials tailored to the unique challenges faced by law enforcement personnel. "We're not here to assign blame," he told his colleagues during one session. "We're here to learn and grow. Every mistake is an opportunity to improve." Petty Officer Daniels and Ensign Carter, too, found renewed purpose in their roles. Daniels became a mentor to younger officers, sharing lessons learned from his own missteps. Carter, meanwhile, spearheaded outreach efforts aimed at strengthening ties between the Coast Guard and local communities. Together, they worked tirelessly to rebuild public confidence in an institution still reeling from criticism. Public perception of the Coast Guard slowly improved, though skepticism lingered. Social media platforms remained battlegrounds for opposing views, with hashtags like Reform Coast Guard trending alongside critiques of its handling of the incident. Activists seized the moment to demand broader changes, calling for legislative measures to combat racial profiling across all levels of law enforcement. While progress was uneven, momentum was undeniable. For Admiral Johnson, the journey was far from over. Though the immediate aftermath of his arrest had subsided, its impact continued to shape his worldview and priorities. He threw himself into advocacy work, partnering with organizations dedicated to promoting diversity and inclusion within the military. He participated in panel discussions, wrote op-eds, and delivered speeches at universities and community centers. Each engagement reinforced his belief that meaningful change required sustained effort and collaboration. One evening, as he sat on the porch of his home overlooking Chesapeake Bay, Marcus reflected on everything that had transpired. The waves lapped gently against the shore, their rhythm soothing yet constant. He thought about the young officers who had detained him, their uncertainty, their fear, their eventual growth. He thought about the anonymous caller whose apology had opened a door to forgiveness, and he thought about the countless individuals who never received apologies, who carried the scars of injustice silently. Marcus knew that true equality wouldn't come overnight. It would require patience, persistence, and courage. But he also knew that moments like this, however painful, carried the seeds of transformation. As he gazed at the horizon, painted in hues of orange and pink by the setting sun, he felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead was long, but it was illuminated by the promise of a brighter future, a future where no one would be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. With that thought, Marcus rose from his chair and walked back inside, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The waves may have been choppy, but the tide was turning. And with each passing day, he grew more determined to steer toward a world where justice truly prevailed, for everyone. The months following Admiral Marcus Johnson's arrest had transformed not just his life, but also the lives of those involved, as well as the institutions they represented. The incident became a turning point, a moment that forced people to confront uncomfortable truths about bias, accountability, and systemic reform. For Marcus, it wasn't just about personal vindication. It was about using his experience to drive meaningful change. As time passed, the lessons learned from that fateful evening rippled outward, touching countless lives in ways both subtle and profound. By early spring, Admiral Johnson had cemented his role as a quiet yet powerful advocate for justice. He continued to speak at conferences, universities, and community events, sharing his story with humility and purpose. His speeches weren't fiery or accusatory. They were measured, thoughtful, and deeply human. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he often said. "It begins with small steps, listening, learning, and acting with integrity." These words resonated with audiences, inspiring many to take action in their own spheres of influence. One such event took place at a historically black university in Maryland, where Marcus delivered a commencement address to graduating seniors. Standing before a sea of eager faces, he reflected on his own journey, from a young boy growing up in Georgia to a decorated Navy admiral. "When I was your age," and he began, "I didn't know if my dreams would ever come true. There were days when doubt crept in, when the world seemed determined to hold me back. But I kept going, not because I thought I could change everything, but because I believed I could change something." His voice softened as he addressed the students directly. "You are the leaders of tomorrow. Your voices matter. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Whether you're working in government, business, education, or any other field, remember this: progress is possible. But it requires courage. The courage to challenge injustice even when it's uncomfortable. The courage to listen to perspectives different from your own. And the courage to lead with empathy and compassion." The crowd erupted into applause, cheering loudly as Marcus stepped away from the podium. Many graduates approached him afterward, thanking him for his words of wisdom. One student handed him a note that read, "Thank you for showing us that we can rise above adversity. You've given us hope." Marcus tucked the note into his pocket, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This was why he did what he did, not for recognition, but to inspire others to believe in themselves and their ability to make a difference. Meanwhile, within the U.S. Coast Guard, the reforms initiated after the arrest had taken root, reshaping the organization's culture and practices. Training programs now emphasized critical thinking over rote adherence to protocol, encouraging officers to question assumptions and seek evidence before taking action. Implicit bias workshops became mandatory for all personnel, fostering open dialogue about race, privilege, and fairness. Officers were taught to view each interaction through a lens of respect, ensuring that no one was judged solely by appearance or circumstance. Lieutenant Harris emerged as a key figure in these efforts, earning praise for his leadership and commitment to reform. Once burdened by guilt, he now channeled his energy into mentoring younger officers, helping them navigate the complexities of modern law enforcement. "We're not perfect," he told them during one training session, "but perfection isn't the goal. The goal is to keep getting better, to learn from our mistakes and strive for excellence every day." Petty Officer Daniels and Ensign Carter, too, found new purpose in their roles. Daniels became known for his calm demeanor and willingness to admit when he was wrong, qualities that earned him the trust of colleagues and civilians alike. Carter, meanwhile, spearheaded initiatives aimed at bridging gaps between the Coast Guard and marginalized communities. Together, they worked tirelessly to rebuild public confidence, proving that accountability and growth were possible even in the face of failure. Public perception of the Coast Guard slowly shifted, though skepticism remained. Social media platforms buzzed with debates about racial profiling and institutional reform, with activists demanding transparency and accountability. News outlets highlighted stories of individuals who had faced similar injustices, amplifying calls for legislative changes to combat systemic bias. While progress was uneven, momentum was undeniable. Organizations across the country began adopting best practices modeled after the Coast Guard's reforms, signaling a broader cultural shift toward equity and inclusion. For Admiral Johnson, the ongoing transformation served as a reminder of the power of resilience. Though the scars of injustice still lingered, so did the promise of progress. He carried framed letters of apology from top Coast Guard officials in his office, not as trophies but as symbols of accountability and growth. Each letter represented a step forward, however small, toward a more just society. As summer approached, Marcus returned to Chesapeake Bay, drawn once again to the water that had been both a sanctuary and a witness to his ordeal. The yacht drifted lazily across the surface, its white hull gleaming in the sunlight. For hours he sailed alone, letting the rhythm of the waves soothe his mind. It was here, surrounded by nature's beauty, that he felt most at peace. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden light across the bay, Marcus sat on the deck of his yacht, reflecting on everything that had transpired. The arrest had been humiliating, infuriating, and painful, but it had also been transformative. It had forced him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the world around him. It had tested his patience, his faith, and his resolve. And ultimately, it had strengthened his belief in the possibility of change. He thought about the young officers who had detained him, their uncertainty, their fear, their eventual growth. He thought about the anonymous caller whose apology had opened a door to forgiveness. And he thought about the countless individuals who never received apologies, who carried the scars of injustice silently. These reflections weighed heavily on his heart, but they also fueled his determination to keep fighting for a better future. Marcus knew that true equality wouldn't come overnight. It would require patience, persistence, and unwavering courage. But he also knew that moments like this, however painful, carried the seeds of transformation. As he gazed at the horizon, painted in hues of orange and pink by the setting sun, he felt a renewed sense of hope. The road ahead was long, but it was illuminated by the promise of a brighter future, a future where no one would be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. With that thought, Marcus rose from his chair and walked back inside, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The waves may have been choppy, but the tide was turning. And with each passing day, he grew more determined to steer toward a world where justice truly prevailed, for everyone.